Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very special conversation on doing sociology. It's our endeavor here in doing sociology to promote the dialogue between the global north and the global south, and also create a platform for public sociology. On that note, today we have with us Dr. Rahul Ranjan as well as Alf and Kenneth, and we are going to talk to them about multiple issues that are contemporarily very relevant. Rahul has agreed very generously to co-host this interview with me. Let me just introduce him to our viewers. He has already written a piece for Doing Sociology. He is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the OsloMet University, Oslo. He is working on a project titled The Currents and Consequences of Legal Innovations on the Rights of Rivers, funded by the Norwegian Research Council. He has a PhD from the University of London, and he has also been the associate editor of the journal International Journal of Human Rights. We welcome you, Rahul, to Doing Sociology, and over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm equally happy to be here and have an interview with Alf and Kenneth today. To begin, I'll introduce both our speaker. Alf Gunvald Nilsen is a professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Pretoria. Amongst other, he's an author of his latest book titled Adivasi and the State, Subalternity and Citizenship in India's Bhil Heartland, published by the Cambridge University Press. He writes extensively on relationship between social movements, state formation, and the political economy of development and democracy in India. He's published several articles and a number of edited volumes. Our second speaker today is Professor Kenneth Bo Nielsen, who is an associate professor at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Oslo in Oslo, Norway. Amongst other, he's the author of Land Dispossession and Everyday Politics in Rural Eastern India, published by the Anthem Press in 2018. He works on social movement in contemporary India and has published, with a special particular focus on land and environmental question. At the moment, he's working on how popular movements and activists mobilize the language and institution of law in struggle over land and nature. So I'm very happy to have both of you here today. And we would begin with our first question, which is to both of you, which is you both worked on the political economy of development and democracy in India. And you've done so from the point of view of social movement who struggle over the direction of development and meaning of democracy. So if you were to give an outline of an analysis of what India looks like today from this point of view, what would the outline look like?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you both for this invitation to be part of Doing Sociology. It's an honor for someone like me who wasn't even trained in sociology, even though I did spend 3 years in a sociology department some years ago. So when I started my own work on social movements in India, I wasn't particularly interested in questions of political economy. I was looking at, or wanted to look at, the internal dynamics of land movements to understand better how they cohere or fail to cohere in agrarian settings that are often starkly unequal, and how they deal with social fault lines connected to caste, class, and gender, to name just some. So my interest in the kinds of questions you raise here, they only for me emerged later, and partly in conversation with Alf when we had the chance to work together on a research project that was titled Social Movements and the State in India, Deepening Democracy, ? And Alf may correct me later, but I think this question mark was quite intentional. I mean, we both share the conviction that social movements can indeed be agents of democratic deepening, but it's not given that they will automatically have that effect. So if I were to answer your question a bit more to the point, I think there's no doubt that progressive social movements in India today find themselves in a very difficult situation. pressured from all sides by an assertive Hindu nationalism that is now dominant both in the state, but also increasingly in civil society, and which uses a quite potent mix of violence and state law to bully and silence movements. I mean, we've seen this with the protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act, against the legal changes to the status quo in Kashmir, and we see it now with what's happening to the ongoing farmers' movements. Um, and if one looks at the recent Varieties of Democracy report, that's a report published from Gothenburg University in Sweden, that report is pretty unambiguous in this regard. It asserts simply that the world's largest democracy, India, has now turned into what they call an electoral autocracy, and that the diminishing of freedom of expression, of freedom of the media, and freedom in civil society have declined the most since 2014. And if we look back to the pre-Modi years, I think the Indian government quite rarely, if ever, used very extensive censorship. But now such censorship efforts have in fact become rather routine. And if we look at again at this Varieties of Democracy report, it concludes that in terms of censorship, India is just as autocratic as is Pakistan, and it's performing worse than its neighbors Bangladesh and Nepal. And that is, of course, partly because civil society has been muzzled to such a large extent. I mean, the indicators in the VDEM report gauging the level of repression of civil society organizations in India shows severe deterioration over the past couple of years. While on the other hand, unsurprisingly, those movements who align themselves with the Hindutva movement have gained more freedom over the past couple of years. So I think these sort of developments quite evidently reveal how progressive social movements are now in an extremely difficult situation when it comes to not just deepening democracy, but simply defending it, much less influencing the direction of social and economic development that you also asked about.
So if I can follow up there, and I'd like to also echo Kenneth's appreciation for the invitation. It's great to be chatting with you guys. I obviously share Kenneth's analysis and concerns, and I simply want to add that it's important that we link what we're seeing in terms of the shrinking of democratic space in Modi's India to neoliberalization. The reason I say this is quite simply that Modi's hegemonic project rests on two pillars. On the one hand, an authoritarian and majoritarian politics of Hindu nationalism that brands dissent as an anti-national activity and polices dissent as if it was a threatening enemy within. And on the other hand, of course, the second pillar is that of furthering the neoliberal restructuring of India's economy, which has been ongoing since the early 1990s. Now, the rise of Modi, of course, was also the rise of a strongman leader that promised his followers that he would bring both the Hindu nation and the magic of the marketplace. And we've seen that very clearly during the pandemic, when the same government that used the lockdown to as a cover under which to subdue the nationwide protests against anti-Muslim citizenship laws and to persecute central activists in that movement also rushed through pro-market legislation in India's parliament. So I'm talking here, of course, about the new farm laws and the new labor laws, as well as a number of other legislative changes, for example, to regulations around environmental clearance for mining projects and so on and so forth. So what we're seeing then in India right now is a coeval effort to constrain spaces of democracy on the one hand, and I think expand spaces of accumulation on the other hand. And the coercive thrust that we're seeing is, of course, a challenge to social movements, not in the sense that activists in India are unfamiliar with state repression or that there was no state repression prior to the coming of the Modi regime, but rather that the Modi regime operates on an unprecedented level of intensity when it comes to repression, as we've seen just during the past few weeks when there have been numerous raids on independent media houses, where we've seen the ridiculous arrest of Disha Ravi, a young climate activist, on very flimsy charges. And what all of this means then is that social movements can't just focus on organizing and mobilizing in democratic spaces. They actually have to, alongside of doing this, organize and mobilize in defense of those spaces, which I think adds in many ways to the odds that they're up against. And this is, of course, very much a concern in terms of the ongoing farmers movement as well, which has been nothing short of impressive in terms of its resilience in the face of government coercion and media vilification as well.
Right. So, one of the central issues here in question is, of course, land and land struggles, and how they have sort of played into India's, development trajectory. How do you see the question of land still being important in the social movements that are being led today in the Indian context?
Well, I think it's important to start by simply putting in place this sort of very simple insight, which is that the land question is and always has been crucial in relation to social movements in India. So from the coming of independence onwards, land has been at the center of conflicts between the Indian state and subaltern groups. The modernization of the country's economy was predicated on mining, the creation of industrial areas, and the construction of a built environment for production in the form of large dams, for example. And all of these projects impacted on land, and that land often belonged to disadvantaged rural communities, for example, Adivasis, who, although they constitute merely 8% of India's population, make up as much as 40 to 50% of those who have been displaced by large dams since independence in 1947. And these processes then of dispossession have continued after the onset of neoliberalization, when the globalization, not just the modernization, but the globalization of India's economy came to depend on such things as special economic zones and corporate investment in mining. Now, if we want to understand why these issues become contentious, it's important to be aware of the simple fact that those who were displaced were rarely compensated or resettled properly. And that is, of course, where all of these conflicts emanate from. People were subject to impoverishment, people were thrown out into India's informal economy as disposable labor, as surplus populations circulating between the countryside and the city on very adverse terms. And an example of this is, of course, the Narmada dam conflict, which I looked at as part of my doctoral studies and later on wrote a book about. Now, what's exemplified by the Narmada anti-dam movement is that it's important to bear in mind that movements that protest dispossession of land have tended to do much more than simply advocate for proper resettlement and rehabilitation. They have, in fact, framed their opposition to dispossession as a critique of the overall direction and meaning of development in India. So questions have often been raised about how dispossession reflects an uneven and unequal development trajectory and an elite-controlled political system. And we've seen the emergence out of those critiques again of compelling visions of more just forms of development and more participatory forms of politics. So again, then, the land question is obviously pivotal in terms of understanding movement landscapes in India and generative, if you will, of oppositional discourses of development. And if we want to reflect on what movements opposing dispossession have achieved, it would be easy to simply be downright pessimistic in one's assessments. For instance, the dams that have been constructed on the Narmada River are just one of many examples of how movements against dispossession have failed to win their key objectives. So the Narmada Bachao Andolan, of course, wanted to stop dam building on the Narmada River. That very much failed. And if we were to go with an assessment that says that these movements have failed, we would be thinking in flawed terms, as far as I see it, because one very important result of India's so-called land wars is, of course, that policy discourse has changed and that the rights of those who are being displaced have to be accommodated in one way or another. I'm not making the suggestion here that their rights are necessarily accommodated in an adequate way, but certainly it's very evident that by the sort of early 2000s into the 2010s, it was no longer possible for Indian authorities and for corporate interests to simply continue with business as usual. And the Land Acquisition Act, the new Land Acquisition Act, or rather Resettlement and Rehabilitation Act of 2013 is an example of this. Again, the law is not an unequivocal victory.
It seems we might have lost Alf. Let's hope we get him back soon. I mean, I don't have much to add to what Alf said just now. I mean, the land question evidently remains crucial, and again, we don't have to look very far. I think the ongoing farmers movement provides a very good illustration of the centrality of the land question, with farmers fearing that these new neoliberalizing reforms will mean that they eventually will lose their land. Um, I think it also makes sense if we consider the land question in relation to the issue of jobless growth. There are quite many farmers with small or marginal landholdings who might dream of non-agrarian futures, that is, of living lives outside of a crisis-stricken agricultural sector, but who also know rather well that these dreams can not always be realized, apart from perhaps through precarious labor migration, which is effectively far from always more attractive than being in agriculture. And I think, I mean, my own work in contexts of land dispossession in the monograph that you mentioned, Rahul, when we started this talk, and also importantly in the work of the American sociologist Michael Levien on the same issue, shows that farmers are quite aware of this. I mean, that it's the land remains in many ways central. And Michael Levien has written about this, about how this semi-proletarian condition where farmers retain even a modest land base from which to work from is often much more advantageous than to being fully proletarianized, if you like, being fully deprived of your land with nothing to sell but your own labor power. And of course, we need to keep in mind, as Alf also mentioned, the Indian state's very poor record on rehabilitation and resettlement when it has displaced and dispossessed people of their land. So I think it's no coincidence that if we look back on what sort of spawned my own interest in looking at land questions in India, namely the Special Economic Zones Act from 2005 and the subsequent drive for industrialization through land dispossession, it's no coincidence that those kinds of policies triggered the kind of very strong and often violent reactions from farmers' movements and civil society.
Right. So we should move to our next question, which is of a very generic nature, in a sense that I wanted to know how relevant are right-based approaches to the struggle of social movements in India today, specifically in relation to land, but also more generally.
Alf and I discussed this question because we were fortunate enough to receive it in advance, and a chance has it we kind of agreed that I should take the lead on addressing this one. So even if Alf is not here for this particular question, I think I can speak for the both of us. This is something that we have worked on quite extensively jointly, and have also some outputs on this. And to be honest, I mean, it's a hugely complicated question, and I'm not dismissive of the rights-based approach, but I don't see it as a kind of magic bullet either. When I began my own PhD work, it's now quite many years ago. The so-called Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor had just been formed. This was in 2005, and this was an independent international organization that was hosted by the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. And that commission proposed strategies for creating inclusive development that would empower people living in poverty through increased protection and legal rights. And a couple of years later, it published a report that proposed so-called 4 pillars for legal empowerment of the poor: access to justice, rule of law, property rights, labor rights, and business rights. So the idea of using legally enshrined rights for the poor to bring people out of poverty goes back many decades. And of course, India has its own impressive rights-based agenda being rolled out under the former UPA government, including legally enshrined rights to work, rights to information, right to food, and so on. This is, of course, well known. So I think what's noteworthy and what has been written about extensively also is how the right to work, for example, as enshrined in Nariga, makes it different from the older top-down employment generation programs. I mean, it was also designed to foster a kind of active citizenship, to engage people in monitoring and evaluating the program, and through this to generate a more widespread awareness of rights and what it means to have rights, and not least to enhance the capacity of the poor to exercise those rights. And this is important, I think. And had Alf been with us still, he could have said much more about how important this is for marginalized social groups in India to have at least some capacity to hold the state and government officials accountable, to be able to claim rights by reading the law back to the state or by waging law struggles, to use Nandini Shunda's terms that she coined years back. And this is especially the case, I think, in contexts where Alf has worked that are characterized by forms of everyday tyranny. So as Alf and I wrote in one of our joint publications on this question, law, and that includes rights-based approaches to law, I think is an important modality through which social movements can in fact seek to assert their opposition to the marginalizing consequences of contemporary neoliberalism. But as we also have written about in these outputs, the law, in a sense, cuts both ways, as my former PhD supervisor once wrote with reference to China. In that sense, law and the legal codification of rights can also, we argue, serve as a vehicle through which a compromise equilibrium, in the Gramscian sense, between social groups can be constructed in such a way that it furthers consent for neoliberal development strategies. So while the rights-based approach was at least in part driven from below in India, its embrace by the government can also be seen as a concession worth making in order to keep up momentum for the process of neoliberal restructuring. And again, Alf might have more to say about this based on some of the work that he's done on the UPA government as a case of inclusive neoliberalism in contrast to what we have today. So just to wrap up my answer to this question, clearly there are limits to the rights-based approach, but at the current conjuncture where Indian democracy is under threat, one of the most promising and also most readily available starting points for a progressive social movement project might actually be found in these rights-based laws. As much as we do agree that this legislation was put in place to engineer a kind of politics that would stabilize the long-term advance of neoliberalization, if we take seriously the idea that the law may be indeterminate in nature, this would mean that the oppositional potential of these rights-based laws cannot be exhausted by the intention of the people who drafted these laws. Rather, the question of whether rights-based laws can be made to serve also counter-hegemonic ends will not be settled by the letter of the law alone, but by the uses to which this law can be put by social movements. And in the context of the current moment, such as the present, where Indian democracy is seriously under threat, I think the purpose of perhaps working to reanimate rights-based legislation would be simply to rekindle some of these initial meanings, while also working to add more radical new layers to underpin what could evolve into a far more expansive conception of citizenship.
Right. Alf, now that you're back, would you like to add anything to the relevance of a rights based approach in looking at the struggle of social movements, particularly in the context of India today?
Well, I think Kenneth has more or less covered, the key parts of that ground. But my argument is simply that when looked at from the point of view of subaltern collective action, rights-based politics have to be approached in an instrumental manner, which is that on the one hand, we have to recognize the importance of rights. I think anyone who simply dismisses rights as being irrelevant is a person who's never been without rights. It's someone who's never found themselves in the position of being rightless, of being a subject to arbitrary and absolute forms of power. And that is, of course, the significance of being a rights bearer, that you're in a position to be able to make claims and demands, and you're in a position to use those rights as a tool with which to challenge power. At the same time, of course, it's important to be aware of the limitations of the rights-based paradigms. The kind of limitations that come with power relations in society, power relations that underpin a determinate political economy of development, for example, which will result in violations of rights, whether we like it or not. And that's, of course, what we see with a lot of movements, that movements can mobilize on the basis of rights-based claims, and they can make headway with doing that up to a certain point. For example, the point when they begin to destabilize more sort of fundamental power relations in society. And that's when the pushback comes, very often in the form of repression. And there are many movements that have experienced that in the Indian context. And that also goes to rights-based legislation. I think that what we saw under the UPA government was an attempt, if you will, by the Congress to come back as a governing party by appealing to poor majorities in India, saying that we are going to put in place a legally inscribed form of social citizenship, which provides social protection, which will underpin survival and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, the way that Congress, as a party that remained committed to a neoliberal accumulation strategy, used those laws was to secure subaltern consent to an overall development trajectory that generated marginalization, that generated dispossession, and so on and so forth. There wasn't that kind of decisive shift in power equations in society, which could also change the overall trajectory of development, if you will. And that tells us quite a lot about some of the limitations to using rights-based approaches, which you always have to factor in when you use them. There's no guarantee. And I think that's really important from a strategic point of view, that we remember that whatever we do strategically, it doesn't come with any guarantees. So a lot of this is about pragmatism and a kind of instrumental pragmatism, using tools for what they're worth based on a clear-eyed understanding of precisely what they're worth.
Right. So my next question is specifically for you. In your book, Adivasis and the State, you've tried to look at the idea of citizenship through certain case studies of organizations, particularly ones working in amongst the Bhils. So you critique the existing theories that look at civil society as separate from political society. Could you elaborate on that a little more, in the sense that, how do you see citizenship amongst the Adivasis, and why is a rethinking of the state crucial to that?
Okay, well, so my point of departure in the book is the fact that Adivasis, although they are formally rights-bearing citizens of the Indian state, in actual fact are, that is, in terms of their actual relationship to the Indian state, they're rightless subjects. This is not just in terms of the kind of large-scale repression of civil and political rights that we associate, for example, with counterinsurgency campaigns such as Green Hunt, or for that matter, with large-scale dispossession. It's more in terms of everyday interactions with the local state and its officials, which tends to be characterized by the coercive extraction of bribes, by constant threats of violence and uses of violence by state officials against Adivasi communities, and of course an absolute absence of any kind of democratic accountability on the part of the local state. This is what I call everyday tyranny, so basically a rightless existence in relation to the state. Now, what I try to look at in my book is what happens when Adivasis mobilize against this kind of rightlessness. And I try to show that their collective action is not simply confined to the domain that Professor Chatterjee refers to as political society, that is the domain of governmental categories, or for that matter, confined to negotiating partial accommodations of their existence with state bureaucracy. On the contrary, as I show in the book, Adivasis often use the law to challenge everyday tyranny. Local authorities were confronted over specific episodes of malfeasance by, for example, forest rangers or police constables, by movements that in fact demanded that legality should prevail in local state-society relations. And by engaging in this kind of legalism from below, these movements actually created a civil society where previously there was only everyday tyranny. So contrary to Chatterjee then, who only mentions Adivasis briefly in his work on the politics of the governed, and when he does, he locates them beyond even the realm of political society. I conceive of Adivasi movements as agents that, when they organize and mobilize against rightlessness, make active use of the universalizing vocabulary of democracy. And then when they do this, they also generate new forms and meanings of citizenship. Now, citizenship is, of course, most fundamentally just the right to have rights. And the movements I studied most definitely claimed this right for Adivasi communities, but they also did more than that, because they went beyond liberal political frameworks to claim rights of self-determination and resource control for themselves. So there was an element of claiming ecological, cultural, regional sovereignty, if you will, going on. And what these Adivasi communities gave rise to then was a kind of culture of what James Holston, writing about the urban working class in Brazil, has called insurgent citizenship, which demanded justice for Adivasis in quite radical ways. And what all of this points towards for me is that we need to think about how subaltern politics is always embedded in state-society relations, and that this embeddedness both enables and constrains collective action in different ways. So a binary analytical optic just it won't do. It won't capture that complexity. It won't capture that relationality, which is at play here. And it's crucial that we focus, I think, on how hegemonic projects are negotiated, even in the context of very unequal power relations. And we need to look at how these hegemonic projects are always underpinned by some kind of balance between consent and coercion. So we need a more refined, more sophisticated, I think, concept of how the state works if we are going to truly understand both the sort of potentials and the limits of claiming rights, of claiming citizenship, of generating new cultures of insurgent citizenship.
Yeah, thank you so much. But before I ask the last question to Kenneth, it's in my personal observation, I see how your work, Adivasi and the State, seamlessly speaks with Kenneth's work on land and dispossession in the way that forms this conversation, makes this conversation very interesting, because we see the similar observation that Kenneth has in his work. So my question then to Kenneth is that you've had an interesting essay, which talks about the distinction between an activist and a politician, and a common sense that sort of common sense understanding would not be to distinguish between these two categories. But from your study from Bengal, tells a different story. For instance, you've written about those who have tried to cross over to the other side, namely from an activist to a politician, have had to bear its cost. They either had to give up one of these roles or trace out a different identity for themselves. So based on the shared language of morality, dignity, and honor. So firstly, what is the distinction between the two categories? And secondly, what are the costs and stakes that a shared language of morality that you've written about?
Thank you for this question, Rahul. It might require a kind of a longish answer, since I would need to give a bit of context to this article, which by the way I think went unnoticed for quite a number of years, but then suddenly there now seems to be some interest in it, and that might have something to do with the sort of the escalation in activism in India, which means that this is something people are now on the lookout for, which is only a good thing. The article you mentioned here is I think from 2012, so it's nearly 10 years old, and it's titled "An Activist Can't Become a Politician," but that's not really a title of my own making. It's a quote from the main protagonist of the article, a well-known Bengali poet, musician, and social activist, and he is mentioned by his name in the article, so I can reveal without much ado that this is Kubir Shuman. He was at the time I met him, which must have been in 2006, 7, involved in the land struggle in Shingur against the land dispossession for a Tata Motors factory that was set to come up in rural Bengal. And as a social activist involved in this movement, he was brought into to close contact with leaders of the Trinamool Congress, who played an important part in this movement, and also this included the party leader Mamta Banerjee, who then later offered him a ticket to stand for the Lok Sabha elections, which he did in 2009, and he won. So he was a Lok Sabha member for I think a full 5-year period. So I think you're right, as you say, if you look at what social activists do and what Indian politicians or local scale party politicians, what they do pretty similar things. No, I mean they're very mobile. They travel around to towns and villages. They engage people. They seek to mobilize people. They seek to organize them behind particular agendas or particular demands. Much of what they do is, if you look at it as a form of practice, is actually quite comparable. There are many differences too, of course, but there are some clear similarities in what they do. And I noticed this when I did my own work on the movement in Shingur, where many of the local grassroots party politicians with great ease moved into this land movement to influence it. And vice versa, where many people who became activists through this movement at a later stage with little difficulties moved into local political parties from where they stood for elections to mainly the local panchayat, but also in some cases for the state assembly. And that's partly because the kind of social capital you acquire as an activist, the kind of networks you build up, the kind of skills at organizing that you learn are also very valuable within a political party. So this kind of capital, if you like, can be equally used. It's equally valued in both contexts. So in a sense, you're right. An activist can quite easily become a politician, and vice versa. You might ask. So for this reason, I was kind of intrigued by this quote from Kubir Shuman, which is actually from a newspaper interview that he did at some point in his political career. But I was curious to know, what did he mean when he said that an activist cannot become a politician? And that was kind of paradoxical, because that's precisely what he had done with spectacular success, no? Moving from a social activist to becoming a member of the Lok Sabha. So I try to locate the answer to this question in a particular perception of the self among at least some social activists, namely that the world of party politics in India is a dirty world. It's a world full of corruption, of scandals, of self-serving and greedy people who are willing to make all kinds of compromises for personal gain, and for personal gain only. A polluting view of corruption and immorality, you might say. And this is a view of politics that's, of course, not exclusive to social activists. It's a more widely shared view that one encounters in India. And of course, it's not entirely without reason, we might say. In contrast, I think social activists of the kinds like Kubir Shuman, they tend to think of themselves as occupying kind of an oppositional, pure or uncontaminated space from which they serve the people selflessly and with little regard for personal gain. a space where one can act fiercely independent, where one only has to listen to one's own inner moral voice. And this is, of course, an ideational distinction. If you look at the actual practices, it's hard to uphold, but at the level of ideas, it's a meaningful distinction, but it's one that requires a good deal of discursive work, I think, to maintain this distinction. You constantly have to convince yourself and others that this distinction is actually true. This is not to say that many social activists are not attracted to party politics. And I think back to the Shingur movement again, when those relatively small bands of independent activists, mainly from Calcutta, would travel to and from Shingur for meetings and local rallies and so on. And they were always given a warm welcome by the farmers. But it was evident to everyone that those who could make a real difference for this movement, it was political parties. No, I mean, if Mamta Banerjee came, there would be a crowd of 5,000 farmers. If a group of activists came, there might be 50, 100. She would bring truckloads of food and medical aid. Activists might manage a few hundred recycled blankets and some songs and poetry if they were lucky. And this is, of course, important in its own right. It is not to belittle the kind of work, but it pales in comparison. The material difference that political parties can make. In that sense, the role of activists, materially speaking, was quite limited. So this would be one attraction of party politics, of being able to make a real difference on a very big scale. I think many people would be attracted to being capable of making this kind of distinctions. But of course, as I read about in the article, when you join a political party, you precisely join a party. And that's a party full of leaders, other leaders. It's an organization with established ways of doing things, of sharing spoils, and so on. There are many considerations and many responsibilities to other leaders, to supporters, to followers, and so on. And of course, you need to face elections, and elections need to be won. And often you can't win an election on morally pure rhetoric alone. So what I write about in this article about Kobe Shumon is the kind of disillusionment that this transition leads to. He becomes deeply illusioned by what he has to do when he becomes a politician. So he ends up leaving and he resigns, doesn't stand for re-election. But what I try to write about is the way he frames his departure from party politics, which also he does in the kind of moral language that you mentioned in your question. When he quits politics, he doesn't say that I couldn't make it or I couldn't cut it, that he wasn't capable enough or that he had been sidelined or outsmarted by a more clever politician. It was always about him choosing to recuperate, you might say, his moral and ethical self by ostensibly returning to this purer space of independent activism. So that's what I take his statement to mean, and note that I'm not passing judgment on anyone in this article. I mean, I'm not passing judgment on the protagonists, not on the activists, and not on the party politicians either. What I do is try to identify this particular political language that people use to explain and understand the actions that people do when power and influence are at stake. And when I think back now to when I wrote this, I was inspired by the work of Maurice Jones, the Welsh political scientist, and his work from the 1960s on the different idioms of Indian politics. That is, the different styles and languages that politicians use when they present themselves and when they talk about power and influence, and which has also been developed further by colleagues in Oslo. So what I'm looking at really in this article is more sort of the languages and styles of self-presentation by people who wield and who seek power, regardless of whether they do this as activists or as party politicians.
Thank you. So before Rituparna would conclude the session, I'll just say two very specific comment I have about the conversation. One is I'm very thankful to Rituparna and Doing Sociology for having me in this interview session and to learn a lot always from both Kenneth and Alf. So I have two observations. One is that apart from, of course, the sophisticated account that both Kenneth and Alf has produced in terms of rich ethnographic material, but also very, very sophisticated reading of theoretical framework that we use in our work, and especially I did during my own PhD. But I think for more general readership of those students who are writing their thesis and dissertation and working on India and marginalization, I think it's very interesting that both Kenneth and Alf offers us a very interesting toolkit, a methodology through which we can approach field by having keen attention to details in the way we collect information and present them, both to the academic audience, but also to more generally to the larger. And second is, of course, the use of these materials that have been produced by both Kenneth and Alf could be used in order to understand questions of subalternity, which is not explained in simple terms of binary opposition, but also are part of very complex network of power sharing, democratic rights, and access to and from institution. So that's my broader sort of suggestion to the wider readership of the Doing Sociology. But thank you so much, both of you and Rituparna, for having me today here.
Thank you, Rahul. I would also like to thank both Kenneth and Alf for giving time to us. It was an absolute pleasure to listen to both of you. And I hope that our young viewers, since we are targeting young sociology students, that they take an interest in the discipline. They learn a lot from this conversation and go back and read some of your works and then sort of go to the field with a fresh perspective. Once again, thank you to both of you, as well as Rahul, for taking time out to do this for us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.